Well, it's good to be here this evening. We're going to be talking about dinosaurs this evening. There's a lot I'm not going to be talking about because I basically have to put 2 sessions into an hour and a half, and normally they're 1 hour long. And so if you say, I wonder why I didn't answer that question, the greater length of time you have, the more questions you can answer. But we will have a little bit of a break in between if there are some questions in between session 1 and 2. There are a few questions out there. So our ministry is called Creation Truth Ministries, and we don't have anything here, but we have the Secrets of Creation Traveling Museum. So often what we'll do is we'll have tables with artifacts. Some of those artifacts will be found in the books, and some of them basically just help augment the case for biblical creation. So some of the material we're going to be talking about is coming out of this book, Flood Fossils, and so that'll be session number 1. Flood fossils, evidence for creation and flood. We're just going to be touching the mountaintops here tonight. Flood fossils, evidence for the creation and the flood. You know, when I went to school, public school, went through high school, I had the idea that fossils showed evidence for evolution, right? And then I became a Christian at 19 years old and said, well, wait a minute. Genesis chapter 1 doesn't seem to be telling the story that I'm getting in school. And so I started doing some research. I said, no, this is what the Bible says. 6 days, thousands of years ago. And so, that's so radical. I mean, we're taught about millions of years, about 4 billion years, 4.5 billion years for the age of the earth. And then we go to the solar system and the universe. And the interesting thing there is when I started doing creation ministry, the cosmos was thought to be 20 billion years old. Now today it's about 13.7 billion years old. And so as I got older, the universe got younger. And you have to start asking questions. What do these dates really mean? And the reality is, if you take a look at dinosaurs, which we'll be touching on tonight, at the turn of the 20th century, dinosaurs were thought to be about 3 million years old. Then they were up to 8 million years old. Then I have literature showing that they were 24 million years old. Then they were 30 million years old. And finally they were 65 million years old. And probably every one of us in here have been taught that dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. But you may have missed it because in 2011 they changed the date to 66 million years ago. What's a million years between friends? The reality is that each of those dates were taught as facts. Question, do facts change? No, they don't. And so they never were facts. This is speculation from the evolutionists. I know there are Christians that are evolutionists. I think they're inconsistent. Nevertheless, let's look at some evidence, and this is basically digging up the fossils. And so let's dig up the fossils in Alberta. Careful if you're caught digging up fossils. It's a $50,000 or 1 year in prison fine. So I prefer to dig fossils in Montana myself. The 6 days of creation, I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but the Bible does say that God created everything in 6 days. And Genesis chapter 1, if you have your Bibles in Hebrew, let's follow along with me today. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz. Now, most of us are more familiar with the English translation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Shamayim is always plural. You have to look at the context to determine whether it's plural or not, because there's no singular form. Nevertheless, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Very few people, Christians, Bible colleges, seminaries, have any problem with this verse. But as we go down through Genesis chapter 1, we see that God created everything in 6 days. And some people say, well, the Bible is just telling us that God created, not how he created. Hold on a second. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And we continue down, and God said, and God said, and God said. The Bible actually does tell us how he created. He created by the very power of his word. He commanded and stood fast. We read the Psalms. Not some long, drawn-out evolutionary process. Besides which, when we take a look at the days of creation, and each thing that was made on each of the days, think about this. If these are long periods of time or something else, we have the dry ground of plants on day number 3. And if that's a long period of time before the sun, what do plants need to survive? Okay, they need the sun. So in the context of Genesis 1, we have night, evening, morning, number, day. That context tells us it's talking about ordinary days. Now, it doesn't matter if I disagree with that. It doesn't matter if you disagree with it. But that's what the text actually says. 6 ordinary days. And we have this word, yom, in Hebrew, which is the word for day. And let's take a look at the English word day. Back in my grandfather's day, it took 14 days to clear an acre of land working during the day. And so context is important. Back in my grandfather's time, it took 14 24-hour days to clear an acre of land working during the daylight portion of a 24-hour day. So context is important. And in Genesis chapter 1, as I mentioned, we see night, evening, morning, number, day. And then evening, morning, number, day, etc. So let's take a look at the use of yom, or day, outside of Genesis 1. It's found with night 53 times. Always means an ordinary day. Day with evening or morning found 23 times each always means an ordinary day. In fact, evening and morning are such powerful modifiers that when they are found together, a total of 38 times outside of Genesis 1 and the rest of the Old Testament, without the word day, always means an ordinary day. Day with the number about 410 times. And essentially always refers to an ordinary day. So God's pretty clear what he's talking about here. Summarized here in Exodus 20:11, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. He blessed the Sabbath day, set it apart for the purpose of worshiping him. So we work 6 days, we rest one, because God worked 6 days and he rested one. Now, Jesus believed in biblical creation. Now, I prefer the term biblical creation as opposed to young earth creation. Why? Well, because we're talking about what the Bible says. Does that mean the earth is young? Yes, but I prefer biblical creation. Nevertheless, Mark 10:6, Jesus speaking, he says, but from the beginning of the creation, God created them male and female. Not from the beginning of their creation, but from the beginning of the creation, God created them male and female, humans, Adam and Eve. So, we have two options here. Either we have a young earth option. Some people think there's an old earth option. Well, let's take a look at this. So here's the old earth view. The Big Bang, about 13.8 billion years ago, and that would have been the beginning of the creation. Then we have the earth 4.5 billion years ago, and then Adam and Eve between 6,000 and 200,000 years ago, depending on which old earth advocate you talk to. Are Adam and Eve from the beginning of the creation? Not according to that timeline, but according to this timeline, absolutely. And so in the beginning, okay, that's the 6 days of creation Adam and Eve made on day number 6, and then we have today. And so I don't think there's any question that Jesus was a biblical creationist. Say, well, of course he was. Well, I'm referring to what most people call young earth creation. Mark 10:6, but from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. Well, the Bible does talk about a worldwide flood, and I know some people like to play with words and say it was universal. It killed everything in its scope. Now, it was worldwide. Genesis chapter 7, verse 19 to 23, and the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the hills, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both of fowl and of cattle and of beast, and every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, and every man. All in whose nostrils was the breath of life, of all that was in the dry land, died. God judged the world in those days. It's interesting because the Bible says he's going to judge again, but next time it's not going to be by water, it's going to be by what? By fire. Verse 23, and every living substance was destroyed which is upon the face of the ground, both man and cattle, and the creeping things, and the fowl of heaven. And they were destroyed from the earth, and Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark. And so during the flood, this was a judgment by God. We know what happens with the movement of water. We've investigated those layers, and most of the layers over the planet have been laid down by water. And so the creatures that died, the people that died, they would have been buried in those layers. Now here's an interesting frontispiece, is what is called the beginning portion of the book from 1716 by Johann Jakob Schweitzer. Now he was one of the early geologists, and what you'll find is most of the early founding fathers of geology and paleontology, the study of fossils, were Anglican clergymen, or they had a Christian belief system. And so they were looking at the world through the lens of Scripture. And they said, well, wait a minute. There's all these dead things that we find in the rocks, and the first time there was death was after sin, and the first time we would have a lot of water to mix a lot of mud, to lay a lot of layers down with those dead things, and later become fossils would have been Noah's flood. And so this is not a new idea. This goes all the way back in the church to the 4th century as far as being recorded in writing. Christians who have thought about this deeply have always believed that most, not all, most of the fossils formed during Noah's flood. Shattering the myth of evolutionary terminology. Now, many of us are probably familiar with this, the geologic timescale, sometimes called the geologic column. Well, first of all, there's only one place in the world that you can see this entire geologic column. Does anybody know where it is? In the textbooks. In the textbooks. That's true. Now, originally, many of these names were given by young earth creationists, that people like to use that term, biblical creationists. For example, when they found rocks and fossils in Cumbria, or Wales, okay, and they found similar rocks and fossils elsewhere in the world, they were called Cambrian, just like the ones in Wales. And then there were some other fossils and rocks they found in Wales, Ordovician and Silurian. Those were named after the Ordovices and the Silures Welsh tribes. And so these are all fossils from Wales. Devonian. This is when the scientists would find rocks in Devon, England, and pontificate upon the meaning of these rocks beneath their feet. And so, what does Devonian mean? Rocks found in Devon. Right? And so anytime they found similar rocks and fossils to those in Devon, England, they're called Devonian. Now in Canada, we have Carboniferous. Now in the U.S., they like to be a little bit different. No, nothing net there to our brother in the back there. But here we have Mississippi, and any idea where those were originally found? Mississippi, Pennsylvania, and here we have Permian. Now these are rocks and fossils that were first discovered near Perm, Russia. Triassic. Tri means what? 3, and so this is 3-layered, 3-colored deposit. And then we have Jurassic. In 1795, Alexander von Humboldt was fossil hunting in the Jura Mountains, J-U-R-A, and he found particular fossils there. Anytime they found similar fossils to what he had found in 1795, they were called Jurassic, fossils from the Jura Mountains. Here we have Cretaceous. This is from the Latin Cretus, which means chalky. And so Cretaceous deposits originally just meant chalky deposits. Now here on the top we have tertiary and quaternary, or quaternary, depending on how you'd like to pronounce it. Now, anybody know what those terms literally mean? Any biologists here? Tertiary and quaternary. Okay, so in biology you study proteins and you have primary level of organization, secondary level of organization, tertiary and quaternary. Okay, so this is the third and the fourth. Now, why do we have number 3 and number 4 up at the top? Well, that's actually been brought over from the original naming system, which was a 3-part naming system, which later became a 4-part naming system. So this was the original naming system. Primary rocks were rocks that God created during the creation week. Secondary rocks were rocks that formed during Noah's flood. And tertiary rocks were rocks that formed after the flood. And then they added a 4th category, quaternary rocks seen forming in the present. So May 18th, 1980, Mount St. Helens erupts, and we have some new material there to look at, and so those would be quaternary. We saw it forming. Now, what would the evidence be if creation were true? It's an important question, and I've asked this question to a number of secularists. If creation were true, what would the evidence actually be? I mean, if you're digging up the fossils and you're looking at the fossils, what would the evidence be if creation were true? I mean, if you don't know what the evidence would be if creation were true, how do you know what you're looking at is actually evidence for evolution rather than creation? Interestingly, this gentleman, Charles Darwin, knew the answer to that question. Why? Because his only earned degree was in theology. Theos, God, logos, the word about, and so theology is the word about God. And so if you want to know something about God, you have to study which book? the Bible. And so Darwin knew that the Bible said 10 times in Genesis chapter 1 that God created creatures to reproduce after his kind, after their kind, 10 times in Genesis chapter 1. The implication is that one basic kind doesn't turn into another basic kind. Now, there's lots of variation for sure among humans, among roses, but roses are roses, horses are horses, dogs are dogs, humans are humans. For example, simple illustration here. What are these?
Seashells.
Okay, seashells. Anybody want to be a little bit more specific?
Clams. Clam shells.
Okay, how about scallop? Now, if you're on the East Coast, you can say scallop. Okay, so these are recent scallop shells here. Fossil, 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 fossil. Now, question, how much evolution has taken place in the scallop? A friend of mine has been doing creation ministry and research for, I think he's 40-some years, something like that. And he has a diagram on scallops, and in the middle of the page, this comes out of a textbook, you see the spiraling and a couple of other spirals over here, and it's showing the evolution of the scallops. And then you look on the side, and you say, okay, these are drawings of the actual scallops, it's supposed to be 40 million or whatever it is, and then down here. And what you realize when you look in the middle of the page, wow, look at evolution, it's so amazing. And then you look at the actual scallops and say, hold on a second, that kind of looks like scallops have turned into scallops, which is exactly what you would expect or predict based upon Genesis chapter 1. God created things to reproduce after their own kind. In fact, you can go to the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology in Drumheller, and they have a terrarium, all of these plants and trees, and they call it Cretaceous Garden. Why? Because all of those plants and trees and things that are growing, living there, have been found with the dinosaurs, and they're still here today. I'd like to suggest that they change the name from Cretaceous Garden to God created things to reproduce after their own kind, Genesis chapter 1. See, they call those living fossils, but the reality is a fossil by definition is supposed to be dead. When you find it's still alive, it's a little bit of an embarrassment. Case study, digging up the fossils in the real world. So here we go. Mountain peaks, okay? The hHall Creek Formation. So this is one of the formations in Montana that I dug for a period of about a decade. And if you ever go down to Montana, in Glendive, Montana, there's the Glendive Dinosaur and Fossil Museum, which is a creation museum, not an evolution museum. Anyway, the first year I got there in 2005, this was a lower dig site. I call it the lower dig site just because it was lower and straighter, but nevertheless, and so we started digging there, and the team the year before had actually done a pretty good job. And we find dinosaurs. Now, this is the upper dig site. These are students from Montana Bible College, and I was out there for a week, and we dug up the actual evidence, and I give lectures in the evening. And it was interesting. Some of these students came in and said, I believe that God used evolution, or I believe that the world's billions of years old. Christians, some said, I believe the world is 6,000 years old. Wow, that was radical. But it was interesting to see the change when they started digging up the evidence and actually examining it and thinking about it, and then realizing, hold on a second. I can just believe the Bible as it's written because it fits the evidence in the real world. This is a group of, I'll say, professional creationists, if you will. This is Dr. Gary Parker, one of my mentors, and his wife, Mary Parker. And he started out teaching evolution. He was an atheist. And then you have Brian Thomas, Dr. Brian Thomas from the Institute for Creation Research, another friend of mine. Well, they hadn't dug dinosaurs, so I said, hey, why don't you come to Montana, we'll dig some dinosaurs. And they said, I think we only need 3 days, I know what we're going to find. And basically we found, what we always find there, turtles and crocodiles and alligators and dinosaurs and various different types of plants that are still here today. Well, when we do dig up the fossils, this is just a typical fossil that you might find. This is a caudal hadrosaur vertebra, or a tailbone from a duck-billed dinosaur, and lots of other different types of bones we find. So here I'm holding this piece here because this had already fractured in the ground. There's another bone up here, and here you can see after I put it back together, and so it's actually a distal phalanx. A distal phalanx is basically the very tip of your toes, right? And so And this was part of a frill from a ceratopsian, like a triceratops. And we had a dentist working on this, so you can imagine he was quite meticulous. We find all kinds of different teeth. This isn't necessarily a great one, but we find Tyrannosaurus rex teeth, and Albertosaurus teeth, and Dromaeosaur teeth, etc., etc. And so, yeah, we find the dinosaurs, but what I keep telling people is that what we're finding with the dinosaurs is actually more important than the dinosaurs themselves. Think about it. Dinosaurs suddenly appear in the fossil record, and then they suddenly disappear. None of that's any help to the theory of evolution. But what about everything else we see with the dinosaurs in those layers? So, for example, somebody brings this to me because that's part of my job is to identify fossils and make sure they don't get thrown over the cliff. Well, it's just a rock. And this has a very distinct pattern. And so immediately you can recognize that is a Champsosaurus, which is a creature something like a narrow-nosed crocodile. And so this is the ventral side. We just looked at the dorsal side, and this is the belly side of the same vertebra. If you found the complete thing, pieced it together, this is what you'd have. Something like a narrow-nosed crocodile, Champsosaurus. We also find redwoods. And redwoods aren't very common in Canada, but if you go down to California, you can see some redwoods down there. If you go over to China, you can see some redwoods there. And so this is one of the first redwood fossils that I found, this impression here. And here's one from California the same year. And so there's no doubt about it, redwoods have turned into redwoods. Now, this is a display that the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology used to have, and this is the actual entire cone here. And notice how they name it, Sequoia dendron-like cone. What does that even mean? Well, the reality is it doesn't matter what fancy name you apply to the fossil compared to the living, redwoods have turned into redwoods. And what you often find is that evolution occurs only in the names given to the fossils versus the living. They don't occur in the real world. Now here we have some more redwood, and these redwood leaves, sometimes we call them needles. And these are actually quite long, and we don't find this variety of redwood in North America, but they are found in China. That fossil there is from Glendive, Montana, so here's its living counterpart, Metasequoia glyptostroboides. Now, I'm not going to test you on that, so all you need to know is redwoods, right? But this is a different variety, and it's found in China, but the fossils are found in Montana. And so there are the fossils in Montana and the living from China. None of that's any help to the theory of evolution, but it's powerful, positive evidence that things have faithfully reproduced after their own kind, just like God said they would. Genesis chapter 1. Well, we also find willows. And so here's a fossil willow leaves here and here that we found. And then we went for lunch and went uptown, and this lady had a big willow tree in her front yard. And I said, hey, why don't we ask her if we can collect some of those leaves so we can take the picture right in the field. And so she said, yeah, have as many as you want. Probably thought these Canadian tourists are getting crazier by the day. They want to collect willow leaves off my tree. Sure, have as many as you want. Willows have turned into willows. Crocodiles. Now, this is a crocodile scute, and I was missing this piece. I glued it together, repaired it, and so we find crocodiles with the dinosaurs. Now, don't forget, crocodiles, okay, here's one from Saskatchewan, okay? Now, I'm probably going to get run out of here, but what self-respecting crocodile lives in Saskatchewan today? Okay? Don't take that personally. But the fact is, we don't see any living crocodiles here today. Things have radically changed. We also find alligators. This is an alligator tooth that we found. When we found it, nobody really knew what it was. They're actually quite rare, this particular variety of alligator. And then I found that Jack Horner had one. That's the best one he's ever found. Of course, he's world famous, paleontologist. Not by training, but by passion. Now, this was a display in the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology. I went around Alberta for 2 years talking about it, and I'll get back to that story in a second here. But here's the sign. This is a skull of the earliest known alligator. Now imagine you're an evolutionist and you just found the earliest known alligator. I mean, I would call all the media outlets. I would put the fossils on display, and so we have the oldest one, and then we have the modern one, and then we have the transitional forms in between. Amazing. But let's read the rest of the sign. It is very difficult to distinguish from modern alligators. Wow, what a disappointment. Next to this, they had a sign, and here's what the sign said. Crocodilians, a successful design. Yeah, I don't think that sign maker works for them anymore. But look what they say. Crocodiles and alligators have changed very little since they first appeared some 200 million years ago. Now, why don't they say evolve? Because that's exactly what happened. They appear in the fossil record, and they're still here today. And none of that is any help to the theory of evolution. Turtles. And so we find various different types of turtles. Here's one from the Hell Creek Formation, part of the carapace of a turtle, and you'll see these little lines and dots and things like that. This is a soft-shelled turtle. And so soft-shelled turtles are found with the dinosaurs. As soon as you enter the Tyrrell, they sort of let you know that if you look. And so here's Mama Albertosaurus, here's Baby Albertosaurus. You see there's a little bit of water over here. It's not real water, it's fake water. And what do they have in there? It's a soft-shelled turtle. Why? Because soft-shelled turtles are found with the dinosaurs. But when you leave the Tyrrell Museum, you find that soft-shelled turtles are still here, swimming around in their aquarium. Here we are at the T-Rex Center here in Saskatchewan, East End, Saskatchewan, and there's another soft-shelled turtle, and here's what they say. Turtles first appeared over 200 million years ago. Why do they say appeared? Why don't they say evolved? In fact, I go through natural history museums all over the world, and I keep seeing that word appeared. Dragonflies appeared. This appeared. Because there's actually no evidence that they linked back to anything else. That linking back to anything else is up here. You make up that story. Turtles first appeared over 200 million years ago, and their general body plan has changed relatively little since then. Creatures that resemble their prehistoric ancestors are sometimes known as living fossils. By the way, that's a term coined by Charles Darwin. We went to a lecture at the Tyrrell, and this gentleman had just finished his PhD on the life of Charles Darwin. And he said Charles Darwin, he went around South America, and of course he's very famous for the Galapagos Islands, and he was looking at fossils, and this is what this PhD in Darwin's life said. Quote, Darwin recognized that fossils bore a startling resemblance to their living counterparts, end quote. Wait a minute. Darwin recognized that the fossils looked like the living. And he coined this word, living fossils. So living fossils and they've reproduced after their own kind are fundamentally the same thing. This term may be confusing. All living species are only somewhat different from their early ancestors, but living fossil species show less change and tend to be adapted to a range of environments. Now here comes the excuse. They are under less pressure to evolve. So when you find things don't evolve, you say, well, that's exactly what we'd expect based on evolution. Well, this is exactly what we'd expect based upon creation, based upon biblical creation, based upon the biblical text. Now, what is found and what does it mean? Now, in the Hell Creek Formation in Montana, or the Horseshoe Canyon Formation in Alberta, and you have almost every province are called something else. In every state, it's called something else, but it's all one big deposit. All the way over here, down into South Dakota, etc. So what is found? We find land creatures buried with water creatures. Okay, not only that, but we find freshwater and saltwater creatures among the water creatures and land-dwelling creatures. Now, the saltwater creatures, the Tyrrell would say, no, you're wrong about that. That ray, that stingray, that's a freshwater ray. And those sharks, you find shark's teeth with the dinosaurs, those are freshwater sharks. Hold on a second. I did a whole bunch of study on that fossil ray that we find. We find teeth of it. I found teeth of it. And they have a complete one in the Tyrrell. And that's basically the ray that's still here today. And it lives today where? In the ocean, okay? So when you find something that doesn't agree with your local idea, then you just say, well, that's freshwater. Those are freshwater. Because everything else we find here is freshwater, so it must be freshwater. See, but if there's a worldwide flood, don't be surprised, land-dwelling creatures with saltwater creatures with freshwater creatures all buried together. Dinosaur death, I'm just going to look at this for a couple minutes. First of all, dinosaur death was watery. This is in Makoshika State Park. They have a visitor center there on the edge of Glendive, Montana. And here's a little sign. And let me just read you my favorite part. Researchers in nearby Macomb County uncovered the skeleton of a large duck-billed dinosaur in 1938. As the bones of the 65-million-year-old dinosaur were unearthed, parts of the skeletons of a paddlefish and sturgeon were found. Scientists guessed, I like that, it's real scientific, right? Scientists guessed that when the dinosaur died, it fell into a body of water. The fish in search of food or shelter were trapped in the ribcage. So you can imagine this dinosaur along the edge of a lake or a river. He has a coronary, he falls in, he starts to rot, the paddlefish and sturgeon get caught, and then eventually, wow, look, we find fossils. But this isn't just regional, this is massive deposits. They're not lakes, they're not rivers. And in fact, these fossils face in a certain direction, all the way from Montana, all the way up in Alberta. Well, this is known as the death pose. You see the neck is pulled back, the tail's arched up, the legs are pulled up, and a few studies have been done on that. But let's see what the trail says. Now, I'm going to be leading tours for the trail in June, so we'll see if they took the sign down. We've been asking them to take it down for a number of years. But here's what they say. Ornithomimus. After death, this ornithomimus body lay exposed under the hot Cretaceous sun. Theories suggest the flesh decomposed, muscles dried, and ligaments tightened, pulling the skeleton into a dramatically arched position. Soon afterwards, sediment buried the body, protecting its striking posture for millions of years. Now, that sediment, they know, was laid down by water, by the way. So you have a desert, and then you have a flood. But here's the thing. They actually set out, not the Terrell, but the secularists, set out and did studies on this and determined that you can do whatever you want with those muscles and ligaments, they don't do this. And so they suggested that the reason these dinosaurs were found the way they were is asphyxiation. Now, one of the ways to be asphyxiated is to drown. Another study was done, and they took chickens that had not been frozen, fresh chickens, they plucked the feathers, and then they threw them into cold water. And of course, chickens have a fairly long neck, and lo and behold, just the act of throwing them into that cold water and waiting a few minutes, the bodies turned into this type of death pose. And so both studies are suggesting that they drowned, they were buried, they suffocated in water. Here's another one from the Terrell Museum. Here's another one. And these are found all over the world. It's not just dinosaurs, a lot of other animals as well. And I was talking about this, and my dad said, hey, you know, elk have fairly long necks, and he said, and he was a big game hunter and rancher and everything else with elk, and he said if you shoot an elk through the lungs, you miss the heart, what happens? The lungs start to fill up with fluid, specifically what? Blood. And he said, if that's the case, your shot was off that day, you'll find their necks arched back. But if you shot them through the heart, they drop, the neck is in any position. It's kind of interesting. So this is a quote from the CDC, so we know it has to be true. Data from this mega bone bed provide pretty clear evidence that these and other dinosaurs were routinely wiped out by catastrophic tropical storms that flooded what was once a coastal lowland here in Alberta 76 million years ago. They make sure to get that in so people like myself won't quote them, but I quote them anyway. Said David Ebert, a senior research scientist at the museum and lead author on the study of one of the book's 3 editors. It's unlikely that these animals could tread water for very long, so the scale of the carnage must have been breathtaking. Do you get what he's saying? The water was above the dinosaurs' heads, and so they had to tread water, and just like any animal, at some point, it's over. I'll continue here. Not only can we now explain why these kinds of horned dinosaurs are preserved in such great abundance here, but the tropical storm model also explains why there are so many kinds of dinosaurs preserved in the rocks at Dinosaur Provincial Park, the Drumheller area, and even Grand Prairie, and why they are often found preserved so exquisitely. Why? Because they were buried rapidly. Water, sediment. So a number of years ago, I was out fossil hunting the very day that the river was overflowing its banks. We had a flood there. 3 years later, I found these freshwater clams. Notice, here's one half, there's the other half. 3 years. Here's one half, here's the other half. So clams separate very rapidly after death. But when we find clams with the dinosaurs, and there are billions of them, by the way, with the dinosaurs, some of them are still closed. almost all of them are still attached. This was not a long period of time process. I went down to Glendad, Montana after I was researching these, and I said to the guy, so you ever find the ironstone clams here? He said, no. And I looked behind his leg, and there's one laying on the ground. So it's a big area these clams are found in with the dinosaurs. And so dinosaur death was recent. Carbon-14 in the fossil record. A lot of people think, well, carbon-14, that's not a good method. Well, it's actually a pretty decent method for thousands of years, and that's all it's meant to do is thousands of years anyway, as far as dating things. So this is the CRSQ, Creation Research Society Quarterly 2015, and I co-authored a technical article on carbon-14 found in dinosaur and other bones. So basically, here's what we did. Hell Creek Formation in Montana, and this is a Triceratops hortus bone that we're sawing here with the meat saw in order to get material out of the center, to get the cleanest sample that we can get. This is another bone that was cut the same day. This is from a hadrosaur, duck-billed dinosaur. Material was taken from here, and these were sent to the lab. Now, a secular lab for carbon-14 dating, and the dates came back 25,000, 25, so the bioapatite, that's mineralization. Collagen, that's the soft tissue, by the way. Soft tissue, yeah, that's just soft tissue. Humic acid, that's contaminant. So the gentleman that actually dated this, that was running the lab, he had no idea they were dinosaurs, so he wrote an article showing that you don't need collagen, all you need is what's known as the bioapatite of the bone, and you'll still get a good date, but he thought they were bison bones. That's what he published, these were bison bones. And you might say, wait a minute, that's 25,000 years. Yeah, this is 25,000 radiocarbon years, okay? That's not real time. But the point is, if you ever find carbon-14 in these bones, they can't be millions of years old. They can only be thousands of years old. And so that's what we find over and over and over again, evidence that these fossils were buried thousands of years ago, not millions of years ago. Horseshoe Canyon Formation, so here's another vertebra, and basically we split it in half. We take the material out of the center, and we want to make sure there's not a bunch of mineralization going on here. Take the material out of the center, we weigh it, we send in the sample, and we don't tell them what it is, and time after time it comes back as thousands of years, thousands of years, thousands of years. Exactly what we'd expect or predict. So here's the geologic column. Based on the carbon-14 that we've done, which is actually evolutionists dated fossils here, and then they didn't know what to do about it. They were just looking for carbon. They said, well, let's just throw it in for carbon-14. And it came back at 20,000 years. That was a bit of an issue for them. But nevertheless, let me just go back there. Sorry about that. So all of these fossils from top to bottom have carbon-14. Approximately of the same amount, indicating that all of these creatures lived and died at the same time thousands of years ago. Question, what kind of event could you have to lay down all of these sedimentary layers in an event thousands of years ago? Well, the early founding fathers of geology, most of them understood that this would have been a flood. Now, of course, they didn't have this kind of evidence at that time. So like I say, evolution is over. Old Earthism is over. We just haven't got the memo yet. So evolution says this creature evolved into this creature, into this creature, into this creature, and the university professors that now teach the theory of evolution. But the actual scientific evidence shows they all lived and died at the same time. One is not the ancestor of another. Soft elastic dinosaur tissue. And I just realized that we didn't hook up audio, or do we have audio through HDMI? Okay. And so this is a T-Rex bone, and here's showing where some of the material was extracted, and they subjected it to different types of acids to remove the minerals, and they found that there was actually soft tissue left in this bone. Supposedly 68 million years old, they claimed. And so here you can see where they stretched it out, it bounced back into place. Soft elastic tissue in a T-Rex femur that they claimed was 68 million years old. Let's take a look at what Dr. Mary Schweitzer, the discoverer, had to say.
I think it's in that sound cord or whatnot you'd have to plug in.
HDMI should do everything, right?
There is a sound
why don't we just skip that? I'll come back to that. But you have a
should be right here that can plug in.
crackle, snap, crackle, pop. Okay, well, that's interesting. I've never seen that before.
As it was, 70 million years old, you don't expect to find soft tissue, do you?
Not at all. No. It was utterly shocking.
So you have to sort of rewrite the book as far as fossilization goes, I assume.
Well, that's the exciting part for me. I've always been very intrigued by how things change in going from a living being to part of the rock record. And like I said, a lot of our science doesn't allow for this. All of the chemistry and all of the molecular breakdown experiments that we've done don't allow for this. So if this material turns out to be actual remnants of the dinosaur, then yes, I think we will have to do some certainly rethinking of some of the basics of the model of fossilization.
You know, Mary, when I was reading about this story, I was amazed that in some of the capillaries, when you went to pull them, they snapped right back. Are you amazed at the quality of these remains?
Absolutely.
70 million years old, huh?
It just doesn't seem possible. But yes, you can actually take the vessels, and they do have internal components, and so you can take a probe and kind of squeeze those things out into solution, and the vessels are fine. It's just, I can't explain it, to be honest.
Very cool.
Well, Professor Mary Schweitzer, congratulations, and thank you very much for stopping by.
Thank you so much.
So everything we know scientifically, she says, we can't explain it. So she went on because she got a lot of pressure from colleagues, and so she did an experiment where she took modern blood vessels from birds, subjected one batch to water and another batch actually soaked in blood. Now blood has hemoglobin, which is rich in iron. And so after a few months, the ones in water started to smell like they were rotting, and they were. And they started to decay. But the ones in blood were preserved for 2 years. And she said, this is it. The very blood itself have preserved the blood vessels. Now, hold on a second, Mary. Since I have a theology degree and I also have a science degree, that's a huge problem to talk about 2 years and try to extrapolate back to how far? 68 million, they claim. Now, that's a huge problem, extrapolation. Now, we would agree that could go back thousands of years. We find mummies and things like that, and that's the same kind of thing that they're finding in these dinosaurs. So everything we know in science says thousands of years, yes. Millions of years, no. Millions of years, no. There's been a lot of people trying to circumvent this, and I have not seen anybody with a successful argument. Creatures, plants, animals, people would have been buried during the flood about 4,400 years ago in the sediment. See, only Noah and his family got on the ark, and the animals, 2 of every kind, 7 pairs of some. Why 7 pairs of some? Because in Genesis chapter 8, you see that Noah did sacrifices. And so if you sacrifice mama and you only got mama and papa, you got a problem with that kind of animal. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4-5 says, God spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the 8th person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly. 8 people survived that judgment of God. Now maybe you're here tonight and you know a little bit about Christianity, or maybe you don't know very much about Christianity. The Bible says there's going to be another judgment on this planet. And the next judgment is not going to be by water, but it's going to be by fire. But the good news is there's going to be a new heavens and new earth for those, if you've placed your faith in the finished work of Jesus Christ on the cross. So Adam and Eve were created, they rebelled against God, sin enters the human race, and we all are sinners, and we need our sin forgiven. And the Bible says that even our righteous acts are as filthy rags to God. Only God can take care of that sin. We can't. All the religions of the world are working to try to please God or the gods. But Christianity is very different in one way, and many others as well. But one major way, Christianity says it's done. It's already been done. It's already been paid. It's a free gift God's offering. So if you don't know Christ today, if you don't know if you were to close your eyes in death today, you'd be with Him in paradise in a perfect place, you can know. Come and ask myself, ask one of the other speakers here, how you can know for sure. John chapter 10, verse 9 to 10, Jesus said, I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved, and shall go in and out and find pasture. The thief cometh not, but for to steal, and to kill, and to destroy. I am come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly. Psalms 119, 160, Thy word is true from the beginning, and every one of thy righteous judgments endureth forever. All right, so that's section 1. Any questions? Any questions on what we've covered so far? Gentleman back there has a question. You have a mic? The mic runner is coming.
Raise your hand.
You were talking earlier, I can't remember what you said, radiologic used? No. What's the term you used there?
Yeah, so RCY,
How do they convert to
radiocarbon
years?
years.
That's my question. Yeah, radiocarbon years. How does that translate to regular years?
Basically, if you ask the lab to do the analysis, they'll give you another date. Okay? So usually they don't charge you, but sometimes they might. But the reality is that there's a few things that I didn't mention because of the time. All these dating methods, including carbon-14, have assumptions, right? And so carbon-14 is made in the upper atmosphere as the rays of the sun strike the molecules, etc., up there. And so plants will absorb carbon-12, which is regular carbon, as well as a very small percentage of radioactive carbon, carbon-14. Now, carbon-14 starts to break down if it's not in the living system, right? So if this plant dies, let's say it's not intaking any more new carbon-14, or this animal dies, not intaking any plants that intook carbon-14, etc. And so the half-life of carbon-14 is about, now our lab uses a different date, but it's about 5,730 years. So if you had 1 ounce, in 5,730 years, you'd have half an ounce. Another 5,730 years, you'd have a quarter ounce. So that's how it works. But it's based on the assumption that the creation and destruction of carbon-14 in the upper atmosphere, what we see today, was always that way. So it's been in this equilibrium for vast periods of time. But the reality is that there's evidence that the flood actually affected the carbon-14 cycle. And so as you get closer, you can date stuff, and I've done this, you can date stuff to about 3,000 years old, approximately 3,000, and it works pretty good. You can use it for authenticating archaeological things like fabrics and hair and whatever. But when you get past the 3,000 years, things start to get exponentially older, and it doesn't make logical sense unless something happened in the atmosphere sometime before the 3,000 years. And so we have 4,400 years, and then things start to come into equilibrium about 3,000 years ago, so about 14 or 1,500 years after the flood, and now from then on forward it works. But you'll get things from the flood that date from 25,000 radiocarbon years to 45,000 radiocarbon years in the very same layer. We know there's carbon-14 there, we know it's endogenous, which means original. But what we don't know is the carbon-14, carbon-12 ratio before the flood. And so that's a quick answer to that. Any other questions? Yes?
In these stratas where you find the fossils, do you find any human evidence?
That's an interesting question. You have to gauge that based on the fossil record itself. So when you take a look at the entirety of the fossil record, 95% of the fossils that we find are marine invertebrates, clams, trilobites, things like that. Then of the remaining 5%, most of those are fish as far as vertebrates are concerned. So of the 5% that are vertebrates, most of those are fish. And it's actually less than 1% where you actually get animals, what we call mammals and reptiles and things like that. So statistically, you wouldn't necessarily expect to find that. The other thing is that what most people may not think about is when we find these things buried together, does that mean they live together? No. Does that mean they died together? No, we don't know if they died together. We don't know if they lived together. We don't know if they died together. All we know is that they're buried together now. So There is some interesting and intriguing evidence that there has been humans throughout that entirety of the geologic record. If we do the reverse, which I'm going to do in the next session, if dinosaurs and humans lived together, right, recently, then that suggests that this whole idea that dinosaurs and humans are separated by 66 million years is not true. So we have the carbon-14 evidence that these are not millions of years old. We have the soft tissue evidence that they're not millions of years old. And then we'll take a look at the evidence from ancient artwork. So there have been some skeletons that may be from those layers. And one of them is in LaSalle, Utah. I don't talk about it because I don't like to talk about anything if I haven't been to the actual location. I used to talk about it, and then God sort of started saying, those who teach are going to suffer the stricter judgment. Right? So I better be sure about what I'm saying. And if there's some evidence that, hey, that's cool, it may be cool, and it may end up turning out to be true, but I'm not going to teach unless I've been there and done my due diligence in the research. So yes, they have found some skeletons. The layers they're in look like they date back to the time of the dinosaurs, but I would need to see some more evidence, go to the actual site myself, things like that. There are also interesting artifacts that have been claimed, okay, I'll use the word claimed, to have been found from layers that are supposed to be hundreds of millions of years old, human artifacts. So there was an iron pot found in coal, and according to the company, that coal is supposed to be 312 million years old, but in 1912, gentleman cracks open the coal. His job was to put the coal in the furnace to produce electricity, and this pot falls out. So we have that. We have the pot. But the problem is, if you don't keep the coal, you sort of lost the proof that it was actually in the coal, right? And so there's a lot of interesting things like that. Intriguing, not absolute, but they would be consistent with the biblical record. Okay, one last question. Yes, sir.
Enjoying your sharing. I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Art Boer. He was a scientist from NASA. He came to Christ, and then he left his position in Berkeley, California. All his colleagues were committing suicide, and he went out to do exactly what you're doing. And he came to Drumheller often. I lived right near Drumheller, but he shared that as a scientist, and he was responsible for banning DDT. Actually, a very brilliant man, very humble man, and he said that he felt in his scientific experience that it was very possible that dinosaurs actually could have stomach gases and burp flames.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so that sort of pertains to session 2, and the idea that, hey, you take a look at Job chapter 41, you've got Leviathan, and it seems to be talking about flames coming out of its mouth, and how's that possible? Well, we have the bombardier beetle, and it can mix these chemicals and shoot them out at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, the boiling point of water, right? We have the electric eel, they can produce what? Electricity. We have fireflies, now they're bioluminescent creatures that can produce light. So I don't think it's actually that far off to believe that there was a mechanism for some of these creatures to actually produce fire. All right, let's get into the next section here. Dire dragons, and so this is based on, so the first section was based on part of my book, Flood Fossils. Everything you see here will be in the Dire Dragons book, but much more. So I'm just giving you sort of a little bit of a look at the evidence. When did God make the dinosaurs? Okay, so common question, and we talked about the days of creation, and all the land animals were made on day number 6. Dinosaurs, by definition, were land animals, and Adam and Eve were also made on day 6. So if you just left your preconceived ideas behind. So in theology, we have a term called exegesis, right? So we open up the text, we look at the context, we look at the cultural, historical context, and we read out what it's actually saying. Well, there's another idea that's called eisegesis. I know most people pronounce it eisegesis, but I've been told by one of the leading scholars in the world it's actually would have been called eisegesis, and that is reading into the text, taking preconceived ideas, whether it be millions of years or dinosaurs before man, and reading that into the text. Of course, that's a theological no-no. What that shows is that if you're a Bible-believing Christian, you need to make a choice. Either God's word or man's word. It's either God's word or man's word. Nevertheless, according to the Bible, dinosaurs and people would have lived together. They were also marine reptiles, which would have been made on day number 5, or flying reptiles, which would have been made on the day before Adam and Eve. And so they're created within a day of each other and Adam and Eve, all of these creatures. Living fossils. Well, I talked about living fossils, and this is the most famous living fossil discovered in 1938 off the coast of South Africa. So a ship comes in, and they have this weird fish, and so they call one of the leading experts, and so this lady comes out and basically said, that's a coelacanth. And so they named it Latimeria chelumnae. Latimeria from the lady's name, and chelumnae from the Chelumna River, which is where it was caught nearby. But nevertheless, this was supposedly extinct. Now, the problem with using the word extinct is it's really hard to prove scientifically. How do you prove something isn't? Okay? So, nevertheless, they found this fish and supposedly died out at the same time as the dinosaurs. 70 million years ago is what they would say today. Well, when we dig up the dinosaurs, as we saw, I didn't show all of these, we find soft-shelled turtles, we find figs, willows. These are actually, the evolutionists originally said they're figs, they're actually a seed that we still have. Crocodiles, alligators, redwoods. So all of these things still found with the dinosaurs, still here today. It really shouldn't be a surprise if we found a living dinosaur. We're finding all these things with the dinosaurs are still here. I want to read you an account. This is a historical record of England, and this is from 1259 to 1406. Now, here's an entry under 1405, appearance of a great dragon. Now, I don't know Latin, and so I had this translated. It had been translated before, but I wanted to make sure it was accurate. Here's what it says. You have to understand that this is not... this is history. So you have all these historical records of the king did this and so did this, and then this appears in the middle of that. In those days, a dragon appeared near the village of Burrs, close to Sudbury. It had an immense body, a crested head, saw-shaped teeth, and an extended tail of great length, a calamity to the country. It slew a shepherd and killed many sheep. The servants of the knight, Sir Richard Waldegrave, you can Google him, by the way, in whose estate the dragon had appeared, marched out and shot arrows at it, but its body eluded all the blows of the bowmen, and the arrows rebounded off its skin as if it were made of iron or hard stone. And the arrows which landed on the spine of its back sprang out, sounding like it had hit a bronze sheet and bounced away because of the impenetrable skin of the beast. Nearly the whole country was called to kill it. But as the dragon found itself being shot at again with arrows, it fled into the marsh and took refuge in the reed bed, and it was never to be seen again. Now, if you go to this location in England, they have a couple signs recounting this, saying if you look back, you can actually see the marsh or the swamp that the dragon entered and never saw it after that. And so it's interesting. Here's how I operate. I start with the Bible. And I look at what the Bible says, and then I say, if that's actually true, what would we expect to find in the real world? I mean, if dinosaurs and people were made on the same day, what kind of evidence would we expect in the world? So we had two of every kind of land animal enter the ark, 7 pairs of some, and then they got off the ark, and so I would expect the dinosaurs went onto the ark, they got off the ark, and somewhere on the face of this planet, someone must have seen some of these creatures and depicted them. Let's take a look and tour around the world and see what we actually find. I'll just show you a couple examples here. There are many more in the book. Dinosaurs in ancient art. Some people say, well, could the artwork be the result of the ancients digging up fossils? Quick answer, no. Why? Well, I have 16 reasons in the book. I'm not going to go through all of those. But let me just give you one. If you find artwork of a particular type of dinosaur or supposedly extinct reptile in this area, one particular area in the world, let's say France, then you would expect that the fossils of that creature are found in close proximity to the artwork. But very often the fossils are found on the other side of the planet. That's just one. There's 15 more reasons. Mexico. And so a few years ago, we went down to Mexico, and this was about 5 o'clock in the morning in what I call the Guatemalan outback. And we were on our way to the Mexican border between Guatemala and Mexico on what they call roads, which were horrendously rough. We eventually got a flat tire on the way back, thankfully. So we get there, and I had a boat set up, and so we go down the Usumacinta River, and we hang a right on the Lac Cantoon. Sorry, but that's the best directions I can give you. And we end up at this shoreline here, and if you look way back in the background, actually this gentleman's here today, I think that's, anyway, somewhere back here, Harry Nyborg from the Big Valley Creation Science Museum was with me, and it was really hot, and so 100% DEET, 140 degree Fahrenheit weather basically causes your skin to bubble, but I didn't want to get bit by anything in there. So here we are, and this is called El Planchon de la Figueras. No visitors go there. No tourists go there. Water overflows it 10 months of the year. Now, we were supposed to be there the year before, but we get into, I think it was Dallas-Fort Worth. Harry can correct me if I'm wrong. And we're just about to get onto the airplane. I remember praying, Lord, I don't want to die in Guatemala. Now, why would I say that? Well, the reason I say that is because I looked at the U.S. Embassy website, and that year or just before, the narcos, okay, the drug dealers said, hey, every driver in Guatemala City needs to pay up safety fee for going through all those different districts. Well, the head guy said, we're not paying you anything. So the first thing they did is walked out and they shot him. And then they continued to kill over 200 bus drivers that year. So you can understand why I didn't really want to tour around Guatemala City at that time. And I also said, Lord, the other thing they do is they stop tourists, strip them naked, take everything they have, leave them on the side of the road. I wasn't really keen on that adventure either. And so I said, Lord, I don't want to die in Guatemala. And then I sort of forgot about it, and we're getting ready to board, and all of a sudden, that's it. They closed the gate down. Can't go to Guatemala. Volcanic activity closed for 10 days or 14 days, something like that. And so I phoned them. I'm like, listen, you don't understand. We have to, there's only 2 months of the year where it's dry, and we have to get down there. And, you know, and then I started to think, Lord, I don't want to die in Guatemala. Okay, all right. And so I started reevaluating. Since then, reevaluating when things don't go the way I want them to go, or the time I want it to happen. And I think, well, maybe God just spared my life there. Yeah, I dropped keys down an elevator chute. Oh, well, okay. Nevertheless, God is sovereignly in control of everything. We did get to go the next year. And here I am outlining this creature. Now, I'd seen a picture of this creature in National Geographic, I think all the way back to 1985. And so I look at it and say, well, that's interesting. And hHall, who was a guy from Guatemala who was with us, our guide, he said, what do you think it is? And, well, the next morning I was able to show him a picture, which I'll show you in a bit. And so this was National Geographic's version, and you can see it's outlined here. How did they do that? Well, they waited until they outlined it in chalk, waited until it started to get dark, did time-lapse photography, and traced it with a flashlight. And so I wanted to make sure that the tracing that they did was accurate, and the only way to do that is to actually go there. And so that's what we did. The interesting thing is, the gentleman that knew where this was, hHall, he was the one that took National Geographic there 20-some years ago, whatever it was. The only guy that knows how to get there. Well, there were some locals in Guatemala saying, what are these guys doing over there? So they get in their boat and they come across, and they had no idea there were petroglyphs there. So here we have this carving into the rock. This dates to about 500 AD, give or take. And this is an Hipparchosaurus, a duck-billed dinosaur, for comparison. Let's go to South America. This is Machu Picchu, one of the most beautiful places I've ever been to. Very dark history as far as spiritually, but very beautiful place. And in Lima, there is the Herrero Larco Museum, and they have thousands of pre-Columbian pieces of pottery on the shelves. And so I spent days in here. And I'm pointing at a particular one here. This is the Huari culture, and lived in Peru up to about 900 AD or so. And so I got looking at this vessel and said, well, it's interesting. And so here we have stylized fish. Every culture has different stylization. Every time period, here's a bird, here's a swooping bird. So here's a guy with his fishing rod, that's true. And here we have this boat. Now, they had some of these reed boats if the tourists wanted to take it out. And he's got a hat. And on top of his hat, it's an interesting creature. It's got this frill at the back, has a bird-like beak, has a big tail, etc. And so when you take a look at this and you compare it to a juvenile Protoceratops, it's actually quite remarkable. Now, there are other places in Peru where we find artwork of what appears to be dinosaurs. This is Chan Chan, and this is in northern Peru. This culture here existed between 900 and 1470 AD, and I actually have a piece of burial fabric. But here we can see fish. And we know they're fish. We may not draw fish like that. They're stylized. So when we're looking at the artwork, we have to understand artistic stylization. Different cultures had different stylization. Different time periods had different stylization. So here we have a what? Okay, it's definitely a bird. I'll give you a little hint. They lived along the shore there. And so it's actually meant to depict a pelican. And here's a piece of burial fabric that we have. And there are interesting creatures on this burial fabric. So you have, again, the duck-like beak, has an interesting head. It has a long tail at the back, it has these circular patterns. I've seen hundreds and hundreds of pre-Columbian fabric pieces of birds. They show the wing, they show the tail feathers. This shows neither. It's not a bird. And those circular patterns are interesting because we found a number of different dinosaurs now which have these circular scales. This is a copy from the Royal Truro Museum of Paleontology in Drumheller. And so there's the fabric. Here is a reconstruction of a Brachylophosaurus canadensis for comparison. We'll continue on here in England. This is King Edward IV. And his brother and him minted these gold angel coins. And so here's one that was minted during Edward IV's reign, 1471 to 1483, and we have St. Michael slaying the dragon. Well, I took a picture of this exact coin, and of course there are many of them. We have one in our collection, not this one, in the British Museum, and 2 years I never used it. I said, well, it's a dragon. And then I started looking at it, so okay, wait a minute, it's a dragon. So how do you depict it any differently if it was meant to depict a dinosaur? And so here we have what appear to be teeth. We have this ridge along the nose. This might be a bone. We have ridge along the back here. We have this morphology or shape of the foot, 3 toes, claws. We have reptilian scales. And this might be an external ear flap. Now, you have to understand that the medieval people believed that dragons had external ears, and many of them had wings. And so the reason I know that they added these things is because some of them were familiar with crocodiles. A lot of people are unaware, but crocodiles inhabited Europe until the early 1700s in the rivers and streams there. And then before that, 1100 or so, they brought crocodiles over from the Nile. But nevertheless, not living dead. Okay. Nevertheless, there's a picture dating to, I think it's the 14th century, of a crocodile, but that's a dragon. Any reptile 3 feet or longer was considered by them a dragon. And so this obvious crocodile, they added external ear flaps. Why? Because dragons have ear flaps. So the only thing that I might say, the external ear flap. Nevertheless, it's accurate in every other respect. And here we have a dinosaur for comparison, Carnotaurus, and notice this ridge up above the eye. Many of these theropods had these bones up above the eye. France. This is Francois I, King of France, from 1515 to 1547. And many of the castles there have the fingerprints of Francois. Now, this is in Blois, and this is the Château Royal de Blois. And so this is the section that was built by Francois, or commissioned by Francois. And so on the outside, we see the spiral staircase. And on the spiral staircase, an interesting creature. Interesting creature. This is from an old postcard. I was there, I took my own pictures as well. But it kind of just looks like a dinosaur. Well, the interesting thing is, it kind of just looks like a dinosaur. Yeah, it does. Now, here's one from the fireplace. There were two fireplaces where they said the original engravings were still original, back to the 1500s. And there was this one fireplace and another one there. Both of those pictures will be in the newest printing of the Dire Dragons book. Nevertheless, here is this creature, and here is a Plateosaurus engelharti in a feeding pose. Why? Well, because now they claim that they walked upright on their hind legs. But if you had food on the ground, what are you going to have to do? You're going to get down there and eat it. So anyway, nevertheless, we see the neck, we see the long, narrow head, teeth peg-like, same size front to back, teeth peg-like, same size front to the back. And when you go back and look at this, you can look at it in 3 dimensions. So if you go on the inside of the strand, you can see the heads are really narrow. And they actually match Plateosaurus engelharti's skull, tooth for tooth, bone for bone, and the overall shape. Inside the castle is this tapestry from Flanders, and here we can see an interesting creature here, another dragon. And as I said, they typically added wings, added ears. And so here it is, and notice where the nares are, the openings for the nose. It has a duck-like bill on it, and it has these overlapping scales. And I thought, well, that's inaccurate. Those are fish scales. Well, no, actually we found scales on these duck-billed dinosaurs on the chest region, on the arms, that are actually overlapping like we see here. And so there is the tapestry, and that dates from the 16th century. And here is a reconstruction of a Maiasaura. So far have only been found in the United States. Quite a few have been found in Montana. And so the artists that did the reconstructions never saw the old artwork. The reconstructions were done based on bones, and then the colorization, I would send them a modern lizard with particular colors that I wanted to use in this case here. Here we are in Azay-le-Rideau in France. Now, if you go to France, supper's at 7. So if you're hungry at 6, you either eat before or you have to wait till 7. Always 2-hour break there. Nevertheless, here we can see Francois Marc, the salamander. Okay, so they call this a salamander, and they associate it, the people that, the tourist people associate this with the fire salamander that lives there today. But there are 2 different types of salamanders in this period of time. In France, there's a regular salamander, a little cute little guy, and then there was the legendary salamander, which was equivalent to dragons in all the other surrounding countries. Now here's a table that was in this castle, and this table was made in 1630. How do I know that? Because the carver was nice enough to put 1630 on the table, right? So I don't have to get in trouble taking samples and then carbon 14 dating, that sort of thing. We only took pictures. Now again, this is another example. I said, well, it's just a typical dragon. But wait a minute. Take a look at the big body, the morphology of the foot, 3 toes, big tail, and you might say, it's got the ear. Typical. It's typical, though. Stylization. Now, remember, this is medieval stylization, 17th century, versus modern stylization, 20th and 21st century. So here's the carving, and here is an Albertosaurus. Now, there's no question, if you look at other animals and things that were carved at that time, there was a stylization. There's no question that the stylization is different, but it's very compelling that this is a theropod dinosaur, something like an Albertosaurus. You might say, well, where are the front legs? Good question. Many of these things don't show the front legs. And a couple of reasons I think that might have been. Anybody ever been to the IMAX where there was a T-Rex scene for about 3 minutes at the end? Okay, well, at the end, there's T-Rex, and he's bigger than life on the screen in front of you. And he has his legs tucked up like this, and as he moves, the one thing that you don't notice is that he has front arms, if you didn't know. And so I think when these people see these creatures, they may have seen them once from a distance, moving, and they see the big hind legs are very obvious, but the little small front legs, especially if they're tucked up like IMAX portrayed them, would be very difficult to see. Now, when we dig up the fossils, they don't move around. Okay, hey, look, he had little front legs. So anyway, Germany. This is Rothenburg ab der Tauber, so my mother-in-law tells me it's pronounced. And it's an interesting medieval town in Germany, and basically wasn't scathed whatsoever by World War II. And so you walk down the streets, it's just like going back in time, and then all of a sudden you come across this fountain, St. George and the Dragon. And this fountain was made in 1608. Here's another view. You notice this is a really interesting creature. It has a skinny head, has a very pronounced overbite. Your orthodontist would love to work on this guy because he could retire after he was done. And then you have legs that aren't out to the side like a crocodile or alligator, but directly underneath the body. And then you can get an idea of how big this is in comparison to St. George and his tiny little horse here, okay? So here's what's interesting. Millions of people have filed by that St. George and the Dragon. There had to be some paleontologists among those, and any worth their weight would have immediately recognized that that was a Proterosuchus. And so here's the creature, and here's a reconstruction. Overbite, skinny head, skinny body, feet directly underneath, and the same size. But here's the catch. According to evolutionists, this creature, Proterosuchus, died out 250 million years ago. Died out. What in the world is some artist in 1608 in Germany doing, depicting him fighting St. George? Here we are in Spain, and this is an altar cloth in Barcelona, Spain, that dates back to 1600. Antoni Siderni was the artist. And when I first looked at this, I said, well, maybe this is like a crocodile or alligator, and then they put a different head on it, and maybe it is one of these mythical combinations. And then I looked at the teeth, and I said, hold on a second. We find creatures with teeth like that in the fossil record, and so I started digging a little bit deeper, and I found this creature called a Nothosaurus. Bone for bone, claw for claw, tooth for tooth, scale for scale, St. George and the Nothosaurus. Now, this creature supposedly died out, went extinct 206 million years ago. What in the world was Antoni Siderni doing depicting him on an altar cloth in 1600 AD? Now, you might have recognized that St. George is fighting different dragons in some of the examples I gave you. Why is that? Well, St. George was a real man. He died in 303 AD, and they have a tomb in Israel. They say this is St. George's tomb. Now, I didn't lift it, and even if I found bones in it, I wouldn't know if it was St. George or not. But the reality is, the idea that St. George slew a dragon became in vogue in the 11th and 12th centuries. And so I don't believe St. George ever killed a dragon. And so different regions that were depicting St. George and the Dragon would depict, I believe, dragons that were familiar with them, dragons that they knew about. And we have sketchbooks from some of these artists. And so I can't prove this. This is supposition. But everything I've looked at, it seems that the artists were kind of the news people of the day. And so if they found a carcass, an artist would come out and he would sketch from different angles, and then that would go into various different books after that. And so kind of interesting. I looked at 1 million pieces of artwork in this study. 1 million pieces. Now here's Nothosaurus from the front. It might remind you of your school teacher. We homeschool, so I got to be careful, right? And so here we have the altar cloth. And again, this was made based on the bones. The artist never got to see this. But then we can pose, because it's a three-dimensional image, we can pose it any way we want it. And so here we have the altar cloth. Here we have the Nothosaurus in approximately the same pose. And we'll conclude with China. This is a jade turtle made by the Hongshan culture in China. And the claim is 4,000 years old. It's possible, but that's the claim, about 4,000 years old or so. And here we have a wild boar, and this is in turquoise. Turquoise is generally blue-green. This is green because it has a patina on it. And you can see the weathering and the drill patterns. All of these things I'm showing you here have been authenticated. And so these are real. They knew how to depict animals. And then we have this interesting creature. This is made out of jade. You can see the diffusive markings from being in the ground. The drill pattern is consistent with ancient drilling techniques. But most people look at that and say, I have no idea what that is. And that might be because you don't know what a graceless ceratops is, which is a bipedal ceratopsian. So Triceratops will walk on the hind two legs, and so these would have been fairly insignificant. We have the hind legs, we have the same basic shape, etc. Here's another example from China. This is turquoise again. These have all been authenticated by a leading expert in the world. And you'll notice here there's a line across the nose showing some differentiation between this portion and the rest of the head. And when you take a look at adolescent Protoceratops, they had this bill as well. And so I believe there's evidence all over the world that people saw these things after the flood. They depicted them. They called them dragons. And the word dinosauria wasn't invented until 1841, which we shortened to dinosaur, went into print in 1842. But the common word was dragon. The scientific word was dinosaur. So once they started digging these up in the 19th century and they wanted to publish on them, they were calling them dragons amongst themselves, the fossils, but they had to come up with words, and so they came up with dinosauria. These are the scientific terms, but they were still calling them dragons. Dragons were dinosaurs. This is the Children's Museum in Indianapolis. Is it a dragon or a dinosaur? And the answer is yes. And so this is an interesting one here. It's on the cover of my book as well. And Draco Rex Hogwartsia, Dragon King of the Hogwarts. Okay, I'm not going to mention anything about the series. I'm assuming you have discernment because you've been here for a while already. Nevertheless, here's a reconstruction. We have another reconstruction that's on the front of the Dino Dragons book. It's a new type of dinosaur that looks like a dragon. Imagine that. When we saw this creature's head, we weren't sure what kind of dinosaur it was. Its spiky horns, bumps, and long muzzle looked more like a dragon. Well, if we start our thinking from Scripture, and the Bible talks about dragons over 20 times in the Old Testament as real animals. Tanin in the Hebrew, literally dragon. Many of our new translations have eliminated that, by the way, because we know dragons are mythological, so we don't want, we should just maybe leave it the way it is. And so dinosaurs and people live together, and there's evidence all over the world that that's the case. We can look at the carbon-14, evidence for recency. We can take a look at the soft tissue, evidence for recency. We take a look at the artwork, evidence for recency. And these three things combine to provide powerful, positive evidence that dinosaurs did not die out 66 million years ago. Psalms 119:60, thy word is true from the beginning, and every one of thy righteous judgments endureth forever. So Adam brought sin and death by his disobedience. Jesus Christ came to bring forgiveness of sin and life eternal by his obedience. If you don't know beyond a shadow of a doubt that if you were to close your eyes at death today, that you'd open them up in the presence of God, in a perfect place, come and ask how you can know. I was 19 years old when I made that decision, and lived most of my life being spoon-fed evolutionism, believing most of it, and like God, were the aliens. Right? So if you would have asked me, do you believe in God? If you would have defined a biblical God, I would have said no. But I think there's something out there greater than us that we might want to call gods. And of course the whole alien thing, I believe, is going to play into end times deception big time. Resources. So if you're interested in the dinosaurs and ancient artwork, Dire Dragons is the book. There's 22, 24 examples in there, and that's been updated and expanded since its original publication. And these books, we go out of our way to make them quality. They're sewn and glued. The paper is the highest quality paper you can get. It's glossy. You'll see lots of rich black, which a lot of printers wouldn't even print. And so these are quality books, but the information is important too. Flood fossils. And so this is basically 3 books in one. Section 1 deals with Noah's Ark. What did it look like and how do we know? The design of Noah's Ark. What did it look like and how do we know? We actually can know. And the interesting thing is it's been 298 years since there's been a good study, good theological study on the design of Noah's Ark. The church lost it. I've gone through all of that literature. Section 1, what did the ark look like? How do we know? Could it have survived until recently? Is there any evidence it did survive until recently? Section 2 deals with the rocks and fossils, showing that the rocks and fossils formed under a watery event thousands of years ago, not millions of years ago. And then section 3 of that flood fossils book talks about fast fossils. So things that have fossilized very rapidly. We have a fence post in there from a farm in southern Alberta, about 110 years, and it's fully petrified. It's completely replaced. There are other examples like it. It doesn't take time. It takes the right chemical and physical conditions. You can have all the time in the world. If you don't have the right chemical and physical conditions, what you're trying to fossilize will just disintegrate into nothingness. And so lots of water, lots of minerals, not lots of time, exactly what we would expect from Noah's flood. Now, this is a book I put out in 2017 called Monumental Monsters, and this is a giant snake fighting a giant crocodilian here. Well, there are 35 examples of gigantic creatures in the fossil record compared to their closest living counterparts. And what are these, I'm going to be talking about this briefly tomorrow, but what do these monumental monsters show, these giant fossils? Well, they show that we've gone from good to bad to worse to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Okay, we've gone downhill, we haven't gone uphill. Yeah, you'll never ask me back again, will you? Yeah. Catastrophic caves, and so this came out in 2020. This is the newest book right now. I'm working on another one. And if you've ever gone through one of those cave tours, they'll say, don't break the stalactites off, don't touch them. You know, those stalactites take 1,000 years to grow 1 centimeter. Now, I heard that in every other cave tour when I was doing research. Okay, I went on commercial cave tours. What are they telling the people? Well, the first thing you get is don't touch the stalactites, 1,000 years per centimeter growth. And then they'll tell you, they'll get into, these rocks are 300 million years old. Okay, they always start, so it's evolution the whole way. I had one exception, and that was in Australia, and went through the cave, and the guy said, stalactites take about 100 years to grow 1 centimeter. I'm like, where did you get that from? And then I found out, because as I was photographing, I saw where they cut the hole to get into the cave, and they put the steel bore in about 100 years ago, and they broke off the stalactites, and they've grown back a centimeter since then. And this is in a cave that's fundamentally dead, pretty much dried right out. So yeah, it doesn't take time. It takes the right chemical and physical conditions. Lots of water, lots of minerals, not lots of time. All of our books, I try to not duplicate what other people have done, so there's new research in all of these books. Amazon Expedition, May 1st, 2012, Harry Nyborg, is he awake? There he is. Okay, and myself, we went into the Amazon rainforest, and we documented this pictograph, which appears to be a sauropod dinosaur. We then used a sophisticated dating method called plasma oxidation to date the actual pigment, and the dates came back roughly 3,000 years ago. So right now we have 5 books. I'm working on a book on the Tower of Babel. So Lord willing, probably about a year by the time we get it delivered. If you're interested in all of the books, all 5 books, it's usually $176.99, but today $125 plus 5% for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. All right, let's just close in a word of prayer. Lord, I thank you for this evening. I thank you for these people that have come out. And I just pray that you might instruct their minds, their hearts. And Lord, if there are any here that don't know you, Father, we just pray that you might draw them to yourself. And that they might come to know Jesus personally, having their sins forgiven. Because he paid the penalty on the cross for our sin. Lord, I just pray that you will go home with these people, keep them safe, free from harm and danger. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, I'm going to be at the back table, so if you have any further questions, feel free to come and see me there.